By 1983, arcade operators were pulling in more revenue than Hollywood. Then the entire industry collapsed so fast that economists still debate whether anyone saw it coming. The numbers tell a story most people don't connect to arcades at all. In the early 1980s, the coin-operated arcade business was generating roughly $5 billion annually in the United States alone. That wasn't a niche hobby market, that was a major entertainment sector, comparable to the film industry. Yet within 5 years, it would crater so completely that the business model itself became nearly extinct. Understanding why requires stepping back and asking a simpler question: how did quarters ever become a fortune? The arcade boom didn't start with Pac-Man, though Pac-Man in 1980 was the inflection point that made it undeniable. Pong arrived in 1972, and Space Invaders in 1978 proved that video games could drive foot traffic. But Pac-Man did something different. It made arcades social. It wasn't a technical marvel. It was approachable, fast-paced, and genuinely addictive. Players didn't need a manual. They got it in seconds, and they came back. Here's the economic mechanism that made arcades so profitable: the quarter-per-play model. A typical game lasted 3 to 5 minutes if you were skilled. Most players, kids with pocket money, lasted 60 to 90 seconds. That's 1 or 2 quarters per session. A single machine could see 200 to 400 plays per day in a busy location. Do the math. That's $50 to $100 daily revenue from one cabinet. Arcade owners paid $3,000 to $5,000 upfront for hardware. Payback happened in 30 to 60 days, but there's a second layer to this system: location economics. Arcades clustered in high-traffic zones: malls, bowling alleys, pizza parlors, movie theaters. A single location with 30 machines could generate $1,500 to $3,000 daily. Rent was cheap by today's standards, labor was minimal, and the hardware was the only real capital expense. Once machines were placed, they essentially printed money. This created a feedback loop. More locations opened, more players showed up, more games got released, more locations opened again. By 1982, the system had reached peak saturation. Donkey Kong, MS, Pac-Man, Galaga, Defender, every quarter reader was a hit. Game publishers were releasing new titles monthly. Operators couldn't stock machines fast enough. Wall Street noticed. Atari went public in 1983 and became the fastest-growing company in U.S. history at that time. Investors saw the arcade boom as the future of entertainment. Money flowed in aggressively. But here's where the analysis breaks down for most people. The collapse wasn't caused by a single event, it was structural. First, the home console market emerged. The Atari 2600, released in 1977, was expensive and clunky. But by 1983 it was cheaper, games were better, and kids could play at home. The arcade's primary advantage, being the only place to play, evaporated. Second, arcade saturation. There were too many machines in too many locations. Operators had flooded the market hoping to capture demand that was actually finite. Third, and this is critical, the business model had an invisible ceiling. You can't play a quarter-drop game more than so many times before you've beaten it or lost interest. Unlike a movie, which you watch once, or a book, which you read once, a game has a saturation point. Once a player mastered Pac-Man, they needed a new game. Publishers couldn't release new hits fast enough to keep the machine revenue flowing, but the real killer was the crash of 1983, not the stock market but the video game industry itself. Atari released E.T., the Extraterrestrial, as a home console game. It was a catastrophic failure. Millions of unsold cartridges piled up. Consumer confidence in home gaming evaporated overnight. Investors panicked. Suddenly, arcade machines looked like a dying medium. Capital dried up. New game releases slowed. And here's the feedback loop in reverse. Fewer new games meant fewer reasons to visit arcades, which meant lower revenue, which meant fewer operators could afford new machines. What's fascinating is that some analysts did see this coming. Economists studying the arcade boom in 1982 and early 1983 noted the saturation signals. Consultants warned operators about home console growth, but the money was flowing so fast that the warnings were drowned out. This is a classic bubble pattern. Exponential growth creates the illusion of infinite demand, late entrants ignore warning signs, and the collapse happens faster than anyone expected. By 1985, the arcade industry had lost roughly 60% of its market value. Locations that had been gold mines became liabilities. Landlords broke leases, machines were abandoned. The quarter economy that had seemed unshakable was essentially gone. What remained was a niche, specialty arcades, fighting game tournaments, and a small dedicated player base. The business model didn't disappear entirely, but it collapsed from a systemic, culture-defining phenomenon to a marginal entertainment sector. The irony is that arcades themselves didn't become obsolete, the economics did. The quarter-drop model worked perfectly when arcades were the only way to play video games. The moment that monopoly ended, the unit economics collapsed. You can't charge a quarter per play when someone can play the same game at home for a one-time purchase. The arcade didn't fail because the games weren't fun. It failed because the cost structure was vulnerable to disruption from the start. This pattern repeats across industries. Blockbuster didn't die because people stopped wanting movies. It died because the late fee model became obsolete when Netflix removed the friction. Taxi companies didn't disappear because taxis were bad. They lost market share when the app-based model made hailing cheaper and easier. The arcade boom and bust teaches us that business models built on scarcity are fragile. Once the scarcity ends, the entire value proposition evaporates. The 1980s arcade generation, the kids who pumped thousands of quarters into machines, didn't lose interest in games. They carried that passion forward. Many of them became the core audience for home consoles, then PC gaming, then mobile gaming. The demand for interactive entertainment never died. What died was the specific economic system that monetized it. The quarter was a payment method, tied to a moment in time when it was the only option available. Today, arcades still exist. You can find them in niche locations, nostalgia-focused venues, and competitive gaming tournaments. But they operate under different economics. They are destination experiences rather than everyday entertainment. They charge hourly or flat fee admission instead of per play. The quarter has been replaced by the card swipe. The business model adapted because it had to. But the golden age when arcades were a $5 billion industry, that was a product of specific conditions that no longer exist. So to return to the original question, how did the arcade boom happen and why did it vanish so completely? It happened because a specific technology, coin-operated video games, arrived at a moment when there was no alternative. The quarter per play model worked because it was the only way to play. The boom was real, the revenue was real, and the cultural impact was undeniable, but the system contained the seeds of its own collapse from the moment home consoles became viable. The operators and investors who built the arcade empire weren't stupid. They just operated under assumptions that were true in 1980 and false by 1985. The demand for games didn't disappear. The players didn't disappear. What disappeared was the economic moat, the fact that arcades were the only place to play. Once that protection eroded, the entire $5 billion structure became vulnerable. The crash wasn't a failure of the games themselves. It was a failure of the business model to account for disruption. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. If you want to understand how economic systems collapse before they happen, subscribe. We analyze the structural failures behind industries that seemed unshakable. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.